It was one of those nights where nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least for me. I had had a long week, and with the weekend finally here, I decided to relax. A quiet night, a few drinks, maybe a bit of fun, nothing serious. So I thought, why not call a girl over? A quick search on my phone, and I was ready. I wasn't looking for anything too deep, just someone to keep me company for the night, someone from a service I'd used before. Nothing personal, just business. I'd been feeling a bit lonely lately, and a bit of company was all I needed. I sent a message, got a quick reply, and soon we'd worked out the details. She'd be here in an hour. Perfect timing. I had a quick shower, changed into something comfortable, and waited for her to arrive. As I poured myself a drink, I couldn't help but feel a rush of anticipation. It was going to be an easy night, or so I thought. But then the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting her yet, but maybe she'd arrived early. I glanced at the clock. It was right on time. I opened the door, ready to greet her with a smile. But when the door swung open, I froze. Standing in front of me was not the woman I had been texting. No, it was someone else entirely. Someone I hadn't expected, someone I didn't immediately recognize. It was Mrs. Henderson, my best friend's mum. I blinked twice to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. What was she doing here? Hey, Mrs. Henderson, I stammered, still in disbelief. What are you doing here? She smiled, a friendly smile that seemed normal at first glance, but the situation was anything but normal. Her presence in my doorway felt surreal. Hello, Michael, she said, her voice calm and collected, but there was something in her eyes that I couldn't quite place. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by and see if you needed anything. My mind raced. I couldn't understand what was going on. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to process what had just happened. Mrs. Henderson wasn't just any woman. She was Tom's mother, the same Tom I'd known since childhood, my closest friend. But this was not the visit I had ever imagined when I thought of his family. I still stood in the doorway, unsure of how to react. The plan I had so carefully laid out was suddenly falling apart. The evening I had expected wasn't going to go as planned, but what could I do? I couldn't just send them away, could I? I wasn't expecting you, I managed to say, struggling for words. I thought you were someone else. She raised an eyebrow. Someone else? Who? I could feel the awkwardness growing between us. I couldn't just blurt out that I was expecting someone from a service, someone who was supposed to come over for the night. That would make things worse than they already were. I had to think quickly. Never mind, I said, forcing a smile. It's just been a long day. Would you like to come in for a moment? I wasn't expecting company, but I suppose we could talk for a bit. Mrs. Henderson looked at me for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded and walked past me into the flat without hesitation. Thank you, Michael. It's good to see you again, she said, her tone polite but with an undercurrent of warmth that was oddly comforting. I closed the door behind her, still dazed and unsure of what to do next. As she stepped into the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just changed. I offered her a seat, trying to remain calm despite the unexpected turn of events. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't let it show. Not yet, anyway. Would you like something to drink? I asked, trying to salvage some sense of normalcy. I can make some coffee, or I've got some wine if you'd prefer. Mrs. Henderson shook her head gently and sat down on the couch. No, thank you. I won't be staying long. I just wanted to look in on you. It's been a while since we had a chance to talk, hasn't it? I nodded, still trying to make sense of the situation. I wasn't prepared for this. This was not how I had imagined my evening, but there she was, sitting on my couch, making casual conversation as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. We spent the next few minutes making small talk. I tried to concentrate on her words, but my mind kept drifting back to the fact that I was expecting someone else, someone completely different. The thought kept nagging at me, but I couldn't say anything. It was too embarrassing, too strange. I was nervous and the air between us was thick with tension. But then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, her eyes locked with mine. The casual tone in her voice changed, becoming more serious. "You know, Michael," she said quietly, "I've been meaning to ask you something." I raised an eyebrow, curious despite myself. What could she possibly want to ask me? "What's on your mind?" I asked cautiously, not sure where this conversation was going. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke again, her voice a little lower than before. "I know that you and Tom are close, but I also know that sometimes things can get a little complicated between friends. Have you ever felt like you might be in over your head?" I blinked, taken aback by her sudden change of tone. "What do you mean?" I asked, genuinely confused. Mrs. Henderson smiled slightly, a knowing look in her eyes. "I just feel that you're not being completely honest with me, Michael. You're hiding something, and I think it's time you told me what it is." I felt a shiver run down my spine. This was not the conversation I had expected to have tonight. The conversation that had begun with small talk had shifted unexpectedly. Mrs. Henderson's words hung in the air like a subtle warning, and I could feel the tension building between us. Even though we were just sitting on the couch sipping our drinks, I wasn't sure how to answer her question. What did she mean by hiding something? I didn't have time to find out before she continued. Her tone was more serious now, and that made my chest tighten. "Michael," she said, her voice calm and measured, "I'm not here to judge you. I want you to understand something. What we talk about here tonight, it stays between us. Understand?" Her eyes locked with mine, and I nodded instinctively. There was something about her gaze, something that made me feel like I couldn't look away, like I was being drawn into something deeper. "I don't want anyone to know what I'm doing," she added, her voice almost a whisper. "It's not something I'm proud of, but sometimes you have to do what you have to do, don't you?" I was taken aback. What was she talking about? It seemed so cryptic, but I could tell she wasn't just talking about the normal things people do. There was a weight behind her words, a burden she was carrying that she clearly didn't want others to see. I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "I don't know what you mean, but don't worry. I won't tell anyone." She nodded, her lips curving into a small, appreciative smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Michael. That means a lot." The room suddenly fell silent, as if the weight of her confession had changed the air between us. I could hear my heart beating in my ears, and I didn't know how to break the silence. Mrs. Henderson wasn't acting like herself. There was a vulnerability about her now that I hadn't seen before. She wasn't just Tom's mother. She was someone with her own struggles, her own history. After a long moment, she leaned back on the couch, her expression softening a little. "I guess I just needed to say it out loud. I don't talk about it with anyone, not even Tom. He doesn't know about the things I've done." Her voice was barely audible, but I could feel the weight of her words in my chest. I didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to ask what she was talking about, to press for more details. But another part of me, I knew this was her story to tell, and it wasn't for me to interfere. Instead, I just sat there in silence for a moment, unsure of what to say next. The awkwardness between us had faded a little, replaced by something else, a kind of quiet understanding. "Do you ever feel trapped in a situation you can't escape?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, not sure what she was really asking. "I'm not sure what you mean." She looked at me with a faint, sad smile. "I don't think you do, but you will eventually. It's inevitable." I wanted to ask her more, to understand her better, but the words didn't come. Instead, I found myself caught in her gaze again, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air between us. After what seemed like an eternity, she changed the subject. "Tell me something, Michael. What's been going on in your life lately? I know we don't talk much, but I can't help wondering how you're doing." I hesitated. It felt strange talking to her like this, but the way she looked at me, the way her eyes softened as she listened, made me want to open up, though I didn't know why. "It's been a bit weird," I said, trying to sound casual. I've just been going through some stuff, I guess. Nothing too serious, just the usual stuff. I shrugged, not wanting to go into detail. She nodded, her expression pensive. Life has a way of throwing curveballs at you, doesn't it? You can't always control what happens. Sometimes you just have to roll with it. I wasn't sure why, but her words hit me harder than I expected. Maybe it was the way she said them, like she was speaking from experience. For a moment, we just sat there, the conversation flowing easily between us, despite how strange it all felt. There was something comforting about being around Mrs. Henderson, something that made me feel like I could forget the tension and confusion that had built up earlier. We talked about everything and nothing at the same time, about the things we liked, about the world outside, about the little mysteries of life. The more we talked, the more I realized how much we had in common. It was a side of her I'd never seen before, a side that didn't belong to Tom's mother, but to a person just like me, with dreams and fears and a history that no one else knew. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but when I looked at the clock it was late, but I didn't want the evening to end, not yet. So I said, a little hesitantly, "Do you want to keep talking? I mean, I know it's late, but if you want to, I don't know, I'm enjoying this." She smiled gently. I am too. It's been a long time since I've had a real conversation like this. It's nice to talk to someone who doesn't judge me or expect anything from me. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want her to feel like she had to explain herself. I just wanted to be there for her, as she had been for me. And so we spent the rest of the evening in quiet conversation, talking about everything and nothing. For a moment, all the weirdness and confusion faded away, and I found myself genuinely enjoying her company. As the night wore on, I realized that the unexpected turn of events had brought us closer than I could have ever imagined. Mrs. Henderson wasn't just the mother of my best friend. She was someone I had connected with on a deeper level, someone who had somehow become more than just a guest in my home. As the night drew to a close, she stood to leave, her posture still graceful despite the weight of the conversation. "Thank you for this evening, Michael," she said with a smile. "It was lovely. I'll never forget it." "Any time," I replied, feeling a strange warmth spread through me. As she walked out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. But I wasn't sure what. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind was racing, replaying everything that had happened with Mrs. Henderson. I kept asking myself the same questions. How did this happen? Why did I feel such a strange attraction to her? And why had she chosen to open up to me like that? It wasn't just the conversation. It wasn't even the fact that she had shared something personal, something so intimate. It was the way she looked at me, the way her eyes seemed to see right through me. There was an undeniable connection between us, even if I couldn't quite explain it. I tossed and turned in bed, the silence of the house adding to my confusion. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smile, heard her voice, felt the warmth of the night we'd shared. But it wasn't just the comfort of the evening that haunted me. It was the feeling that there was something deeper, something unspoken between us. But why? Why did I feel this way? She was Tom's mother. She was off limits. And yet, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that she was different. She wasn't just Tom's mum. She was someone with her own life, her own struggles, her own desires. And somehow, in that quiet room, she had shared with me a part of herself that no one else had ever seen. I needed to see her again. I needed to understand what was going on inside me, what was really happening between us. And there was no better time than now. The next day, after a restless night, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I was going out with some friends, and I knew he wouldn't be home for hours. This was my chance. If I didn't take it, I might never know the answers to the questions that were swirling around in my head. I grabbed my jacket, checked the time, and left the house without a second thought. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say, but I had to see her. I had to talk to her to find out what had happened between us the night before. There was no turning back now. As I drove to her house, the knots in my stomach tightened. What if I had read things wrong? What if she didn't feel the same way? What if I was making things awkward, ruining everything? But no matter how many questions I asked myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something that needed to be addressed. When I arrived at her house, I sat in the car for a moment, staring at her front door. I felt nervous, uncertain, and yet there was a part of me that knew this was the right thing to do. I had to face my feelings, even if it was uncomfortable. Finally, I got out of the car and walked to the door, my steps heavy with anticipation. I knocked once, then twice, before the door creaked open. There she was, standing in front of me, looking just as stunning as the night before, although there was a hint of surprise in her expression when she saw me. "Michael," she said softly, her voice almost as hesitant as mine. "What are you doing here?" I swallowed hard, not sure how to begin. I needed to talk to you about last night." She looked at me for a moment, as if considering whether to invite me in. After what seemed like an eternity, she stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "I wasn't expecting a visit, but I suppose we can talk." I walked in, my head spinning. She led me into the living room and we both sat down on the sofa. There was a palpable tension in the air, something that hadn't been there the night before. It was as if we were both unsure of where things stood between us. I don't know how I feel about last night," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It all happened so fast and it felt different. It felt real. And I don't know if I'm overthinking things or if you felt the same way." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant, as if considering how much she wanted to reveal. Finally she spoke, her voice calm but full of emotion. "Michael, I can't pretend that what happened last night wasn't important," she said slowly. "But you must understand something. I've lived a long life and I've made choices that I regret. I've made mistakes that have shaped who I am today, and I don't want to drag anyone into that." I leaned forward slightly, my heart pounding in my chest. "But I'm not like everyone else. I don't want to judge you, Mrs. Henderson. I want to understand you, and last night it felt like we connected. It felt like you were opening up to me, sharing something real with me." Her eyes softened as she looked at me. "It's not that simple, Michael. I've been through things you wouldn't understand, things I'm not proud of, and I don't want anyone to think I'm looking for anything more, because I'm not. But when we talked last night, it felt different. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in a long time. I could sense her vulnerability much more clearly than before. It wasn't just about her job or the choices she'd made. It was about the wall she'd built around herself, the wall she'd let me see through, if only for a moment. "I don't want to make things any more complicated than they already are," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the truth is, I don't know how to move on either." I could hear the unspoken words hanging between us, the hesitation, the fear. But there was also something else, something that felt like an opening, a crack in the wall she had built. "Maybe we don't need to figure it all out right now," I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "Maybe we just need to take it one step at a time." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. One step at a time. And for a moment, everything felt right. There was no pressure, no rush to define what was happening between us. We were two people sharing something real, something honest, and that was enough for now. The sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting a gentle glow across the room. I woke slowly, disoriented at first, trying to piece together the events of the night before. The warmth of the bed was comforting, but there was an underlying tension that I couldn't shake. As I turned, I saw her lying beside me. Her features were softened by sleep, her hair slightly disheveled. For a moment it felt surreal, as if everything had changed in the space of one night. I couldn't help but smile, even though I still wasn't sure what had just happened between us. But as the memory came rushing back, I felt a knot form in my stomach. This wasn't just a one-time thing. What had happened between us had meant something, at least to me. But would she feel the same? Careful not to disturb her, I sat up and ran a hand through my hair. I couldn't believe I was in this situation. How had we gone from that conversation, that deep connection, to this? But more than that, I needed to know what she was thinking, what she was feeling. She stirred beside me, then slowly opened her eyes. For a moment, we just looked at each other, both silent. It was as if the world had stopped for a brief second, and in that stillness, we both seemed to understand that this was a turning point. She sat up too, her expression unreadable. "Michael?" she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Last night, I don't know how to explain it, but I've never felt so understood, and I don't want you to think it was just some kind of mistake." I swallowed hard, feeling a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. "I don't think it was a mistake," I replied, my voice steady, "but I need to know where we go from here. I don't want things to get awkward between us." She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "I'm scared, Michael," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been through so much in my life, and I've built walls around myself. I never wanted to feel vulnerable again. But last night was different. And I'm afraid that what I'm feeling is just a momentary blip." I could see the vulnerability in her eyes, something she rarely showed anyone, let alone me. It made my heart ache. She wasn't just a strong, independent woman, she was someone who had fought her own battles. And now, after all these years, she was finally allowing herself to feel something again. I reached out and touched her arm gently. "You don't have to be afraid," I said softly. "I'm not going anywhere, but you have to be honest with me. What are we doing here? Because I can't keep pretending that what happened last night didn't mean anything." Her eyes met mine, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken words. Finally she spoke, her voice shaking. "I have been in relationships where I have given too much of myself and ended up empty. But with you, Michael, it's different. I don't know if I'm ready to jump into something serious, but I can't deny the connection we have. And I need you to understand that." I nodded slowly, my heart pounding. "I understand, and I feel the same way. But I don't want to rush into anything either. We've both been through a lot, and I don't want to make things any harder than they already are." She smiled faintly, a hint of sadness in her expression. "I don't want to make things harder either, Michael, but I can't pretend that I don't feel something for you. It's just, I don't know how to handle it." The tension in the room was palpable, but there was something more, a sense of clarity, a realization that we had both entered uncharted territory. Neither of us had expected it, but we couldn't deny the attraction between us. I took a deep breath, then reached for her hand. "We'll work this out," I said, my voice firm but gentle. She squeezed my hand, her eyes locked with mine. "One step at a time," she repeated quietly. We sat there for a moment, just holding hands, as if the world outside didn't matter. There were no more words to say. We both knew we couldn't go back to the way things were. The door had been opened, and there was no closing it. But there was something comforting about the uncertainty. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know where this was going to lead, but for the first time in a long time, none of us felt alone. And that in itself was enough. She rose slowly from the bed and reached for her robe, her movements graceful and deliberate. "I think we both need some time to think about what has happened," she said quietly. "But I don't want you to feel that this was a mistake. It wasn't. I just need to understand what it means." I nodded, understanding her need for space. "I understand. We don't need to figure everything out right now." As she started for the door, she stopped and looked back at me, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thanks for being patient with me." I smiled back, though my heart was still racing. "I'm not going anywhere, and I won't push you. We'll work this out together." She nodded and left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. But as I sat there, I realized that maybe this was just the beginning of something new, something worth waiting for. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. The days that followed that morning felt like they were suspended in time. Every moment I spent with her seemed to last longer, as if we were both savoring the newfound connection, yet cautious of what it meant. There was something unspoken between us, an understanding that we were both navigating uncharted waters. But the more time I spent with her, the clearer it became that I didn't want to go back. I couldn't deny the way I felt every time we were together. There was an undeniable spark, something more than just physical attraction. It was as if we were two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle finally finding their place after all these years. But even though it felt right, I knew we had to take our time. We both had baggage, and jumping into something wasn't the answer. I decided to give her the space she needed, even though it wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to pick up the phone and tell her how much I missed her, but I knew I had to let things unfold naturally. We had shared so much, but there was still so much unsaid, and I didn't want to rush into anything. One afternoon, I found myself walking down the street, my mind filled with thoughts of her. It had been a few days since we had spoken, and though I respected her need for space, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence between us. I needed to know if she was still thinking about me, if she felt as I did. I had been reluctant to visit her again, unsure if it was too soon, but today something inside me urged me to act. My heart was racing as I walked to her house. Every step brought me closer to the unknown. I wasn't sure what to say, but I knew I couldn't wait any longer. When I arrived at her door, I hesitated for a moment. Should I knock or wait for her to come to me? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I took a deep breath and knocked. A few moments later, the door opened, and there she was, standing in front of me. Her face lit up when she saw me, and I couldn't help but smile. There was something comforting about her presence, something that made everything feel right again. "Michael," she said, her voice full of surprise but also warmth. "What are you doing here?" "I couldn't stop thinking about you," I admitted, my voice calm but full of emotion. "I just wanted to see you. I didn't want to let time pass without knowing where we stood." She stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. "I'm glad you came. I've been thinking about you too," she said quietly. I walked in, the air between us charged with unspoken words. There was a feeling of tension, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt more like anticipation, like we were both waiting for something, waiting for the moment when we could finally express what we were feeling. We sat down on the couch, the distance between us seeming to disappear with each passing second. There was no rush, no pressure, just the two of us silently acknowledging the connection that had formed between us. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "and I know we're both scared, but I don't want to ignore what's happening. I don't want to let fear keep me from something that feels real." I reached out and took her hand in mine. "I feel the same way, but I also know that we don't have to rush into anything. We can take our time, figure things out as we go. We have all the time in the world." She smiled, her eyes softening. "You're right. We don't have to rush, but I don't want to hide my feelings anymore. I've never felt this way about anyone before, and I don't want to pretend it's not happening." I squeezed her hand, my heart swelling with emotion. "Neither do I. We may not have all the answers right now, but I know one thing for sure. I care about you, and I want to see where this goes." There was a long silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with understanding, with the weight of everything we had shared so far. And for the first time, I felt we were on the same side. We didn't need to have it all figured out. We just needed to be honest with each other. "I think we've both been through a lot," she said quietly, "and maybe that's why this feels so intense. But I don't want to run away from it anymore." I leaned forward slightly, my voice soft. "Neither do I. Let's just take it one step at a time." She nodded, her eyes searching mine as if looking for reassurance. I could see the vulnerability in her eyes, But there was also a strength, a quiet determination. She wasn't the same person I'd met all those months ago, and neither was I. I think that's all we can do, she said quietly, one step at a time. We sat there for a moment, just holding hands, each of us absorbing the weight of the words we had shared. There were no grand declarations, no promises of eternity, just the understanding that something real had begun between us, and we were both willing to see where it led. As I left her house that afternoon, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew that whatever came next, I wouldn't face it alone. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.